Hey guys, it's Cy and welcome to Ace Podcast Nation. You can find podcasts, interviews and content on a variety of subjects, including mental health, football, films, TV, conspiracy theories, wrestling, music and more. Today's guest is the editor of Kick Magazine and WWE Kids Magazine, host of 90s football podcast Alive and Kicking. Bloody love the 90s. The Wrestling Origins podcast, as well as being one quarter of the biggest wrestling podcast, as previously heard on Talksport 2, the Gorilla position, should I say. I'm very excited to welcome Ash Rose to the show. Welcome, Ash.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, it's good. It's just looking. You've got a long list of podcasts going on there.
Yeah, it's a busy time. Yeah, I like to keep busy, but sometimes I can't keep track myself, to be honest. But yeah, any chance to chat, usually nostalgia. But yeah, wrestling, football, they seem to be the main avenues. But yeah, I've got a few going on at the moment, but it's just fun times.
Yeah, and I think it's what I found since I've been doing this in the whole 6 weeks is it's quite fun. Talk about football, talk about wrestling, done some sort of films of Marvel and stuff, and done a couple of shows on mental health, which are a bit more serious and emotional. But it's good fun. I think it's easier to do if you're talking about stuff that you're interested in and you're passionate about.
Yeah, totally. That's I'm very in a privileged position that I get to work on these things that I've always loved. First and foremost, I'm a fan. I'm a football fan. I'm a wrestling fan, and I'm just very lucky that I get to do these things every day for a living. My wife doesn't always agree because she's not the biggest fan of either of them. But yeah, it's a fun time. It's been a big week this week with the WWE tour, so those weeks are always very manic, and we've done some great stuff for WWE Kids Magazine. So yeah, I'm really enjoying what's been going on, and we've managed to get the Gorilla Vision boys in for a podcast as well, which we haven't done for a while. So that just went out last night, I think. So yeah, we've had a very, very busy week, but a very, very enjoyable one.
Yeah, also I'm lucky. My wife doesn't mind football, so I'm lucky in that respect. In that she likes, she's Cardiff fan herself, so she likes football. So it's not too much of an issue if the football's on or we're talking football. But wrestling, she does not get to talk.
No, my wife she has a brother who used to watch it. Back in the day, like we all did, grew up, in the 90s, and when it was massive, the first boom period over here. So she understands it, she gets it, but yeah, it's been gone from my guilty pleasure, and now I'm actually working on it for WWE Kids. She'll accept it, but yeah, she's not the biggest fan, but I'll get there in the end. End.
So let's start with your work as you're editor of Kick Magazine and WWE Kids. How did that come about? I mean, it seems like the dream job of writing about and talking about football and wrestling. Did you always want to sort of go into that type of thing? Like media writing?
Yeah, I did. I think, well, like any sort of kid, I wanted to be a footballer first and foremost. Then you realise you've got two left feet, and then that dream kind of goes out the window. So the next best thing for me, I've always, from a very early age, I was very boring. I knew what I wanted to do, and that was write about football. I never really thought about writing about wrestling. It wasn't an avenue that you kind of thought about as a kid because it was just kind of a fun hobby. But football, yeah, I've always wanted to be a magazine writer. There are very different avenues you can go in, especially the sort of newspapers. But I've never really been interested in match reporting. I like the kind of feature type, a bit of a magazine geek. I like as a kid, I had sort of shelves and shelves of different football, wrestling, gaming, music, film magazines. Any magazine could go. W.H. Smith was like my mecca as a kid because I just loved magazines, so it was always the avenue I wanted to go in. It's difficult though, it's difficult now, especially because there's not as many magazines around. It was difficult then. I actually started in sales, media sales, which it's not an avenue that's really around anymore, but I was kind of selling classified advertising in local newspapers whilst doing some sort of editorial on the side. Then I was doing the same for Esquire magazine, which is a high-end men's magazine, selling sort of advertorials, as they're called in the business, to clients. And it was kind of that way that Kick was just starting at that point, and they needed somebody I went in basically as an editorial assistant to organise their competition. So that kind of salesy pitch kind of worked. And I was lucky that the team at the time was very small. The football knowledge, and maybe the first to admit, wasn't vast, whereas I was a bit of a stato geek. I think I've lessened in my older age where kids and family sort of takes hold of you more than the football. But at that point, especially, I was a bit of a stato. So I think that helped my cause. And so I quickly went from organising competitions to basically taking on as much of the magazine as I could. And worked my way up to now I'm the editor of the magazine, but it's quite a unique setup for Kick because I work from home. I pretty much write the whole magazine and send it on to designers where the publishers are based in Bath. So yeah, it's quite unique, and not many magazines are set up like that where it's literally one editorial guy doing the whole thing. So yeah, it's a lot of pressure on me to make sure that the content is always good, but I'd enjoy that pressure. I try and slip QPR in there as much as I can, even though it's a bit of a Premier League magazine. But yeah, so I kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but that's kind of how I got to get into it.
I think so. Kick, is it similar to like Shoot and Match and stuff that we'd have had when we were growing up? I've a bit of the same. Football magazines coming out my ears. My parents didn't really like me watching wrestling, but I still managed to get the magazines and the figures and all that sort of thing. So. Did you started with Kick before you got to started doing the WWE Kids magazine?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, yeah, as you say, Kick is very much in the mold of Shoot and Match. I mean, Match is still going as a weekly magazine. Shoot just does an annual, and I think they're still on I got a website that they still produce content on. But as a magazine, it folded a few years back. But yeah, it's of the same ilk. It's monthly, so it's slightly different for Kick. So we can't be newsy. So there's no like match facts and results that we used to have as a kid. It's more kind of the fun and the heroes, talking to the footballers and having fun interviews with those, rather than kind of what happened this week. Because we just, as a monthly, as you know, football changes and straight away. I mean, in terms of WWE Kids, we took on the title, my publisher, which is called Kennedy Publishing. We took on the title in January. So that's very new for me. But I have worked across WWE for about 10 years now, because working in kids magazines is a crossover. So I've worked across another magazine in our stable called Craze Clubs, which is like a general boys magazine. So that covers gaming and films and sport, and WWE is part of that. So I've always covered it for that, and sort of other avenues like Gorilla Position, adult magazines like Fighting Spirit, Talksport I've done work for across WWE. And I worked for WWE Kids at the previous publisher on a freelance basis, so it was my idea. Once we knew there was an opportunity to take it on and make it our own, I was very much at the forefront of that. And yeah, since January we've kind of changed the magazine a bit. We've kind of given it a bit more of life, a bit sort of freshened up the look and stuff, and given it more of a fan's voice, and it's doing really, really well. Everyone seems to be really happy with it, both the WWE and themselves in America and the readers. So yeah, and I'm really enjoying I've done Kick for so long that it's kind of a nice sort of contrast to do 1 week this and 1 week that. So your two loves just sitting there side by side. It's a very nice contrast to be in.
Yeah, I can imagine it. I can imagine it's quite a fun thing, to be doing generally. So like obviously, well, the thing is, there's so much media around with social media and internet and everything. Magazines, like you say, Shoot was one of the biggest magazines out there for football. That's folded. It's because there's so much content everywhere. There's so much, you can read everything on websites and online newsletters and radio shows and everything. So I think the fact that Kick is doing well, and obviously it sounds like Kick has adapted to maybe the change in times and gone to monthly rather than weekly. And I think that's vital to keep. I think it's important to keep books and magazines going as long as possible, because I'd much rather see my kids reading like a magazine or a book than I would see them reading on the internet or a tablet.
Yeah.
Even though they might read the same thing, it's just like a thing for me. I'd rather kind of sort of clinging on to the 90s maybe.
Yeah, no, I'm completely with you. I'm still a fan. If I get on a train, as I was yesterday, I normally have a magazine in my bag, because and I've done that my entire life. So I'm very much with you that I hang on to the magazines, and it is a different beast in 2019. There isn't as many football magazines. You go into the WH Smiths now, and there's very few. Whereas when I was a kid, you'd probably have a choice of 6 or 7 different football magazines. I think where Kick does very well, and where kids magazines do very well, is that kids do still want that physical product, so they can rip posters out of it. You know, we're not ashamed to say that the free gifts have a lot to do with our sales as well, because we obviously have the gift, the magazine, whether it's whatever the popular cards are at the moment, which are match attacks or slam attacks for the WWE, or just football kind of posters and stickers and things like that. So that obviously helps it, but they love the editorial content as well, the posters and the puzzles, and I think that's where magazines are kind of, whereas magazines in somebody like me and you have kind of kids magazines, you're just attacked by this sort of plethora of color because there are so many. In our market, there's kind of 4 or 5 kids football magazines. So that's very, very competitive, but it shows there's still a market because we're all still going and all doing very healthy sales. So I'm pleased to say that the generation, even though we are living in a social world with the internet and social media and things like that, kids are still clinging on to magazines. So hopefully they'll take that through like we did.
Yeah, I hope so. So you're to blame for my youngest son constantly asking for magazines because they've got the toy on the front, or they got something on the front.
Yeah, that's awesome. Sorry about that. Yeah, and everyone who has their kids wanting slam attacks and match attacks. Yeah, we don't help on that front. We feed their hunger for these kind of things.
I think anything which can keep that sort of industry or that part of it going is a good thing for me.
Yeah, no, so definitely.
So obviously a lot of people sort of watching or listening will know you as part of Gorilla Position. Obviously you were on Talksport 2 for a bit, and I think you did. Was it on the Sky Sports website at one point?
Yeah,
or is it?
It was part of Sky Sports fold at one point. Yeah,
which is massive for a wrestling podcast, because it's almost like the sort of unwanted stepchild, isn't it? Wrestling is within sort of sports and mainstream radio stations and sports stations. They don't want to cover it. They don't want it sort of almost classed as a sport. So I think to get on to Talksport 2 was really good achievement, and obviously Gorilla Position took off massively from the start.
No, I have to give credit there to the host, James D'Lo. He's kind of worked with WWE for a long time, so he knows the company very well. But yeah, he managed to push that podcast in all different avenues, and he still is. In fairness, we're still trying to make it the biggest and best wrestling podcast in the UK, which I believe it is. And obviously, I'm biased, but I believe that's what it is. We did work with Talksport, we've worked with Sky Sports. But we kind of wanted to take it on our own kind of way and taking it in our own direction, which I think we're doing at the moment. They've hopefully got some news coming relatively soon on some bigger and better ideas we've got from the podcast, because we've had to scale down slightly in the past year just due to schedules and things like that. But no, we've got a fantastic following. Everyone on Twitter who follows and the kind comments we get, which is really nice to hear that is the appetite for us to come back. As I said, the 4 of us were in the room for the first time this year on Wednesday, which was brilliant for us because it's always good to catch up with the boys, but good for everyone online who's been waiting to see us talk wrestling for a couple of hours. Actually ended up being, it was quite a long show because we hadn't spoken for so long, but we've done really well. James has done really well in pushing the podcast. It's a big name in the industry, which is fantastic, and we get some great interviews. I think the Iconics are on the latest episode with James, so we're really pleased how it's gone. We hope we do some bigger and better things. We've done 2 live shows as well, which we want to do more of those, because it's great to do that to a live audience and get some interaction from our listeners. So hopefully we can do more of those as well. But yeah, it's fingers crossed it's even bigger and better things for Gorilla Position in the future.
So Gorilla Positions, when you first started, it was at a time where there wasn't a lot of UK wrestling podcasts. Podcasting generally was sort of kicking into gear, and you can find podcasts anywhere these days on anything. But I mean, when you started, I don't think there was many British-based wrestling podcasts. But I am really interested how you got started, to that first show, how it became an idea, and how it came about, really.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I at the very beginning, I wasn't part of Gorilla Position. I was a fan, just like you. It was James and a journalist called Rob Lee, who did the original Incarnation. And I think anything starts like these ideas. They start with anything is kind of podcasts in their kind of what they are is just 2 people or 3 people sitting in a room talking about what they love. And I think at one point you go, well, there's an appetite for this somewhere. Everybody sits in a pub or sits at home with their friends and they have the same conversations, really. And it's just finding that niche in the market of maybe something different. Obviously, there are a lot of wrestling podcasts now. Back then, Gorilla Position was kind of one of the originals where they'd recap Raw, they'd recap SmackDown, the pay-per-views, and just kind of chat through all the latest, what was going on in not just WWE, but the wrestling world. So I think it just started as an idea for them that they were big fans. They wanted to share their views. I'm still like it now that if there's a week where we're not doing Gorilla Position or I'm not doing a podcast, I want to talk to someone about it. You want to say, oh, did you see what Bray Wyatt did last week? It's crazy. You want to talk about it. So I think there's always that appetite from fans to want to talk about the latest goings on, especially in something like WWE. It's for want of a better term, it's storytelling. It's like a TV show. It's like The Walking Dead. It's like Game of Thrones. It's something happens every week on the show. So you want to talk about it, and hopefully in a good light. We don't always have good weeks, but that goes with the same with any TV show. So yeah, I think from the very beginning, it was just fans talking about what they love. And I mean, I'm the same with the podcast that I do as well. Alive and Kicking, the 90s football podcast started because I love that era of football and it's retro. Nostalgia is a big part of who I am. I love looking back and talking about the things that meant a lot to us when we were a kid and when we were growing up. And for me, football was better and it was more fun and more colourful back then. So that's why that started. And I think, again, it's just, if you've got a passion for something and you like talking about it, why not do it and find a collective of people that look like the same thing and want to hear it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's pretty much how I got started doing this, was that I'd wanted to do it after listening and watching to various podcasts like Gorilla Position, and I sort of wanted to do it, and then I'd sort of mentally come up with a reason not to do it, and I'd put it off, and then one day 6 weeks ago I just said, right, I'm doing it, and I just sort of did it, contacted some people, and away you go. And I think it's easy to do, in terms of, if you want to do it, you can do it. You just need a webcam and a laptop, and you can do it from your house.
Yeah.
And obviously, if it takes off and things take off like Gorilla Position did, you can expand it and you can get studios. And obviously, I'm interested. How did you jump on board, or how did you come on board with the show then? So they started off with James and Rob. Obviously, you, Skillet, and then Matt more recently joined. How did you become involved in it? Did you know the guys before?
I kind of met James at a WWE event, because once you start doing these sort of, once you're on the circuit, I suppose you could call it, without sounding too sort of, funny about it, it's, you kind of meet the same people, the same journalists, you kind of get to know the guys and stuff. And I'd seen James at a few events and stuff. He was looking to revamp the show, make it slightly different. It kind of, Rob was leaving the show anyway, so he wanted to find a new voice, a couple of new voices, and just sort of mix up the formula a little bit. The fact that I, had a writing background anyway at the time was helped, because we were doing stuff with Talksport, so that was kind of in what we were thinking as well. So yeah, it was literally just conversations with James and getting to know him and becoming friends with him, and knowing that we kind of come from the same era and the same point of view in wrestling, but at the same time also have different opinions, because there's nothing worse than having a podcast and everyone just agrees with each other. You kind of want to bring something different, which is why I think the blend works with us. You got me, who's kind of the nostalgia, kind of baby face of the podcast. I very much talk about that. They call me the white meat baby face. Skillet, who kind of brings the colour and the flavour, but also the complete vast knowledge that he has of the indie scene, which I'm first to admit that I'm very much a WWE fan. I watch indies here and there, but All Elite Wrestling doesn't have me excited as much as it would the rest of the team, because I'm always been about the sort of razzmatazz and the Americana of WWE. So yeah, we got together, we kind of did a sort of test couple of shows to see that we all worked, and within weeks it kind of not only had our friendship grown, and you could see that within the show, but the chemistry between the three of us just really worked. And then Matt coming on board as kind of the newsy kind of guy, kind of worked, because he's got a certain, again, he's very droll. His humour is probably a little bit drier than myself or Skillet or James. So again, it kind of it just added a little new flavour to the show. And the four of us, I mean, I think without blowing our own trumpets, I think we work really well together. We each add our own different elements to the show, and which is why I believe it's been a success so far.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all of that. I like Matt's sense of humor. It's very similar to mine, like really dry. And again, like you say, the difference in personalities only adds to the chemistry of the whole show. Obviously, like you say, there's nothing worse than if you watch a podcast or listen to a podcast and it's 2 or 3 guys and they just all saying this like same thing, or the one person speaks and they say, "Oh, I agree."
Yeah,
I agree. And it's
but
you know,
I mean, on football and wrestling because we all like different things. That's why there's different characters in wrestling. Not everyone likes Daniel Bryan, not everyone likes Baron Corbin. It's each to their own. That's what makes WWE the product it is. And then the same with football. You're a Cardiff fan, I'm a QPR fan. That instantly gives us something different to talk about. Neil Warnock gives us something even nicer to talk about because we both love the guy because he's done so well for both clubs. But there's always a different element to these things. And I think if you've got somebody there who's thinks exactly the same as you, it's not going to work as a podcast. So I think you definitely need that when you're doing something like this. You need kind of a little bit of different flavors here and there of everyone who can give something different and something unique to each conversation.
Yeah. So before we move towards football, I'm going to ask you a couple of things about wrestling because I've asked all my wrestling guests about this. So admittedly, I'm a bit of a mark, as it were, for Bray Wyatt. I've enjoyed all his work. I enjoy, even when people were getting sick of his promos, he was still sort of must see for me. I still looked forward to his segments and shows and stuff. So what do you make of this new gimmick of the Firefly Funhouse?
I'm very intrigued, really intrigued by it. I think Bray's hands are all over this, which is always a good sign. Giving the talent a sort of creative direction to go into. I think that always helps if they're more involved and know what they're doing and it's coming from them. I loved the initial kind of shock value of what he did because everyone was not expecting the fun house and this kids TV show. It was out of nowhere and I absolutely loved it. The whole yowie wowie thing. And it's so recognizable, like a format. Everyone instantly knew, okay, we know what this is coming from. But then even in the first episode, there was this subtle undertone to go, okay, where is this going? And we all know Bray, and I think Bray's been one of the most underutilized talents that they've ever seen. For me, he could have been the next Undertaker, and they've never quite got it right where they should have got it right. And he's been kind of pulled back, pushed forward, pulled back, and never quite got the right. Even only in NXT, I think we saw the best of Bray Wyatt. I don't think he's ever been given a run in WWE, which we all would have booked ourselves. But having seen what happened on Monday and this kind of further development with the mask and stuff, and I was there in London for at the O2 watching it in the arena, and you can I was watching people's faces as it was doing it, and everyone had the same reaction, like what is this? But in an absolutely brilliant way. We sort of lambasted the WWE for not being creative enough, and this it looks very creative. My only concern is how it portrays once he's in the ring, because you can have as many vignettes, because WWE production value is better, second to none for me. The way they did their vignettes, their sort of montages and things like that is always excellent. It's all about now Key, how he does his promos in the ring, how his kind of ring work changes, or are we going to see the same kind of style? So hopefully it will continue in the same vein, but I'll be very intrigued to see how they move from this really intriguing vignette section that we see into an on-screen character, both as a promo and in ring. I wonder if we'll even see him at Money in the Bank on Sunday, which would be very interesting indeed.
Yeah, it's a weird one because I feel like him generally, they got in their own way in that they tried to, rather than him being the next Undertaker, and I think when people say that, they don't mean make him the Undertaker and supernatural and have powers. They meant just this mystical character who's a bit different from everyone else, a bit creepy, and can be quite dominant. And I think they got in their own way a bit and tried to give him this sort of the powers and the this and that. And then I think they never quite knew which direction they wanted to go in with him. Yeah. And like you say, they sort of gave him a push, pulled him back. So the first episode of the Firefly Funhouse, the first time I watched it, I was furious. And I was like, oh my God, what are they doing? They've ruined him. but when I watched it the first time, I had the sound turned down quite low. And I wasn't really paying a great deal of attention. And then I went back and watched it a couple more times. And like you say, the first one was very, very subtle. Like the second one was word of the day is sociopath. So you know that then that that's the way it's going. But I was a bit knee jerk with it, and I was not happy at first. But now I think it's at the moment, I got to be honest, the last few weeks, it's the one thing which I've looked forward to on the sort of on Raw. I'm looking forward to like Money in the Bank. It's one of my favorite pay-per-views. I like, AJ and Seth could be awesome. Samoa Joe and Rey Mysterio as well is awesome. But the Bray Wyatt thing was the one thing which I was like, I really want to see where that's going to go next. If I was booking it, I would have him come into the men's Money in the Bank match towards the end, destroy everyone and take the case and disappear. And not say anything. And because I think that's just something completely different. It's never been done before. Make it interesting, because I think sometimes, particularly recently, they've got into this habit of doing everything very formulaic. The TV and their matches, the breaks are after a dive. So that. And I think, obviously they've got to do that because they've got to have the ad breaks. So they don't want to do it at this vital time where something really important's happening, but it can get a bit, a bit formulaic. No, I don't want to say boring, but like it can be a bit frustrating, especially if you're seeing the same matches week in, week out on TV. So what would you bring him in at, like Bray Wyatt, if you had to sort of book his first initial feud or first appearance? What would you do with him?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there with him, because if he's going to appear at Money in the Bank, he needs to appear in the actual Money in the Bank match rather than one of the title matches. I don't think that would make sense, and it would, the arena goes dark. You see the clown mask or the yowie wowie and the logo or anything like that, and him taking the briefcase or costing somebody and making a difference in that match. It makes sense. I think whatever they do, and whoever they feed him to next, he needs to be dominant. That's been Bray's problem, probably throughout any feud he's done. He's never dominant. He's always kind of been the fall guy. He'll get the upper hand in the promo, in the build-up, but once it comes to the match, he was always the loser. And I think that's what needs to happen. He needs to go through at least a couple of guys. They don't have to be big guys, mid-carders, just to solidify the fact that he's now a dominant character. He's a threat to whether it's the world title or just the WWE in general. That's what they need to do. So I'm not sure who that person is right now. Maybe someone like Ricochet, who could probably take a couple of losses because he's new and people are still just liking his ring style rather than his character, and maybe that could happen. But whatever he needs to do, he needs to be dominant, because that's been the problem with Bray Wyatt the whole way through. For me, the tipping point was the cockroach thing at WrestleMania. It was one of the most ridiculous things that they've ever done.
Weird decision as well, because the actual feud was pretty good up until the sort of that and the House of Horrors stuff.
House of Horrors, yeah. I mean, the thing is, I know what they do with The Undertaker is obviously ridiculous, but as wrestling fans, because we've been watching Taker for, 30 years now almost, we kind of stupidly accept that he's the dead man and the lightning.
Yeah.
And we've kind of just gone, okay, that's fine. And even then, it's still kind of subtle now. They don't go all out. There's the odd lightning bolt and things like that. But they went too far with Bray. There's a believability and a suspense of belief that we as wrestling fans do every week. And it went too far with the cockroaches. And you say the House of Horrors match was just laughable, to be honest. I didn't mind the stuff with Matt Hardy, because we'd already established that the Matt Hardy character was a kind of fun. Everyone knew it was a bit silly, and it made sense for Bray to get involved in that. But now they've kind of given him that very long break, because he wasn't even injured for the second part of his rest. So they've obviously left him off TV for a while for a reason. So that's make the most of it now and make him a dominant force going forward. And the kids, a couple of kids that were around me on Monday night were scared by this, and there's nothing wrong with that, because the Undertaker used to scare the hell out of me as a kid. So let's bring that element into it as well.
Yeah, and I think when you say like the Undertaker used to scare us as kids, but also you'd be glued to the screen and you wanted to see him every single time. So like you say, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think the last thing I'll say on Bray is that I think his master plans need to work, and he needs to win. He needs to win consistently.
Yeah, he needs to be a believable force and a believable character rather than somebody who just takes a loss for the next guy they want to push, basically.
Yeah, and he's got the ability and the character that he could be, one of their biggest stars if they book him right.
Yeah, completely.
Years.
Yeah, and he's a wrestling mind. That's what I mean. This all comes from him. He's got a mind for the business. Obviously, he comes from that background of his dad being in it in IRS and things like that. So the Rotunda family are a big name in the wrestling business. So he's got all that in his locker, and he's got a character. It's so hard these days to establish yourself as, especially the type of character that Bray Wyatt is as well. We WWE, so it's to have that character now and still be relatively believable is really hard. So they need to run with it now and really make him the force that we always wanted him to be from when he was called up from NXT.
Yeah, and I think I always say that there's these days there's no such thing as a casual fan. I think it's a myth because everyone's got the internet, and if you like wrestling or you like your favorite TV show, you look at, even if you don't look at spoilers, you look at the latest news, and you look at what's happening or what's the upcoming storylines or who's joining the cast, whatever it may be. So it's exactly the same for wrestling. So all wrestling fans of all ages are smartened up to the business and what's going on. So I think it is difficult. It's more difficult for these guys to get characters over. And I think it's even more difficult to get a character like that over, which is a bit more out there and a bit different to everything else. But he does it very well. So moving on to football, you've got your Alive and Kicking podcast, which is based. Well, you tell me what it is. Go on.
Well, it's a trip down memory lane, really. It's looking back at the, as we call, the decade that changed football forever, which is the line I always roll out because, for me, if you look at football in 1990 and then look at football in 1999, it's so different. And I don't want to say almost a different sport, but because of the money and the changes that we had in that decade, I think it's different to any other. 2001 and 2010, other than the kits and the players and the haircuts, is relatively the same product. Whereas in the 90s, it changed so much. And everyone who grows up in whatever era thinks that their decade is the best. People would say the 80s. It's just a natural human thing to do. But for me, I was, so in 1990, I was 7 and the World Cup happened, and that was kind of my sort of introduction to football. I still remember crying when England went out the World Cup, and then I kind of grew up then in that decade. So it means a lot to me. Football changed so much, and there were so many characters and mavericks and funny stories, and because we weren't exposed to so much, which is, I love how much football's on telly now because you can watch it every day of the week at the height of the season. But in 1990s football, you couldn't. So you still had these unknown characters that come out of nowhere, like a Toto Schillaci. It is for me the best decade of football ever, and I wanted to celebrate this. And when it started as a book. I wrote a book called Alive and Kicking, which was basically a fun book on looking back at the times, the stickers, the toys, the music, everything rolled into one in kind of like a coffee table book. And we turned that into a podcast. And at the time, there wasn't really anything else celebrating that decade. People, I think, were still clinging on to the fact the 90s wasn't that far away when we're looking at 30 years ago now, the 1990 World Cup. So since then, there's obviously been a few more come up, and 90s is becoming more and more of a decade that people sort of revel in. So yeah, and that's what we do on the podcast. We've had so many former footballers from the decade as well come on and chat to us about their memories. But usually it's myself, 2 other guys, Joel Young and Matthew Christ, who it's quite nice. Again, you have to find the right chemistry, and they're a couple of years older than me, so their memories of the 90s are slightly hazier due to sort of growing up at a different time, whereas mine, because I was slightly younger, so there's that kind of sort of juxtaposition between 3 of us, which is kind of nice. And week to week we just look back at certain elements of the decade. I mean, we've done over 100 episodes now, so there's a lot of stuff that we've covered, and there's still stories to tell. So hopefully we'll keep going. We've got a live episode at the Jumpers for Goalposts festival coming in August, so that'll be really fun as well. So yeah, it's just, again, a passion of mine. I get to chat 90s nonsense with a couple of friends every week, really.
Oh, you're living the dream. So I tell you, live show at the festival as well. Like I was born in the 80s, So like a lot of my influences and favorite bands and stuff come from the 90s.
Yeah.
And it was just an awesome era. Like even now, my kids will try and put stuff on the radio, and I'm on not absolute 90s, thanks. And I have to fight for it, and I usually win. I gotta say, I don't win on the TV, but I win on the radio in the car.
I'm with you. 3-year-olds, they rule the roost. So Peppa Pig rather than Funhouse in my house. Yeah.
Well, do you know what I would say to you? I would say enjoy it while you can, because I got 2 teenagers and a 10-year-old, and
it goes quick. Yeah, and I can.
It goes real quick.
Yeah. I
feel like it was only like 2004 my oldest boy was born, and I feel like that was just yesterday. It's scarily, just goes like, even though you know it's going quick as it's going, you just when the birthdays come around, and I'm like, oh gosh.
I'm already with you. The fact that she's 3 scares the life out of me. So yeah, I can't even imagine when she's 10. So yeah, I will appreciate the times she's not so crazy.
Yeah, I think they chill out a bit, don't they? Once they get to sort of 4 or 5.
Yeah,
just a little bit more calm. Not much, but just a little bit.
Well, they become themselves then, don't they? And they become they're more. You can leave them to themselves, and then their own personalities start to shine through, which is really nice to see. And she's a proper little madam, but we love her. Yeah,
that's it. Once they start finding themselves and their personality, it's really cool time. I gotta say, it's like one of my favorite periods of my whole life was when they were sort of 4, 5, 6. Stressful, but
always stressful. Yeah, always stressful. Yeah.
Yeah, like Alive and Kicking is a really unique idea, and it is right up my alleyway of interests. And like you say, maybe I'm looking in the wrong place, but I don't see many other podcasts or channels other than like your absolute 90s, which are dedicated to sort of 90s, culture and football and stuff. And I suppose because in the 90s, like you said, Italian 90 was the same for me. I'm a couple of years older than you, but like 1990 World Cup was the one where I got the bug of football from it. Like I think I would have been playing it already, but just watching it is just a whole different animal. And like my kids, the younger one caught the bug with Wales in the Euros a couple of years ago.
Yeah,
but he was already playing football and he loved it, and he would constantly play it non-stop. But seeing Wales in the Euros and getting to the semi-finals and seeing sort of players he was familiar with, I think that really hit him. And he even I think, what was it, 2 years ago? God, that's gone quick.
Yeah,
it's nearly 3.
Nearly 3, yeah.
And, he caught the bug of watching certainly like Wales and Cardiff.
Yeah, it's the same especially if your national team does well, like England did in 1990. It kind of you go on that ride, don't you? So I mean, I always say my favourite World Cup bizarrely though is 1994. And England weren't even in that, but for me, the colour, again, Americana, as I mentioned earlier, is something that always attracted me. Has the greatest football kit of all time in it, in the USA away shirt, which for anyone who listens to me on any platform, I must mention that at least once a day. So yeah, that was my favourite World Cup, and I had the Brazil shirt. I've still got it in somewhere in my office as well. So yeah, just the player. I always say the calibre of players of the '94 World Cup is ridiculous. The amount of superstars that were there. But again, the whole decade had some of the best players of all time. You know, we're blessed to see Messi and Ronaldo, but if you go to the '90s and see the calibre of players that were there, you know, your Gascoignes, your Schukers, your Bergkamps, your Klinsmans, just the Cantonars who changed the whole Premier League for what it is today. It changed so much, but there's so much to love about that era.
Oh, absolutely. And I could talk about it for hours and hours. The 90s, it's like music and football of the 90s.
Well, the music. It's somebody asked me on Twitter the other day about if you could relive 1 year of the 90s, what would it be? And it took me more seconds than I thought. But then it came to me in 1996. That was the year. You know, England as good as they maybe have ever been, and not winning Euro 96, and that team of absolute, from 1 to 11, almost world class players. Not quite turned out to be world-class managers, but such an amazing team set to a backdrop of the Britpop era. we all had bowl haircuts. We all wanted to be from Manchester and join in the blur of the Oasis. The Spice Girls were, the coolest thing on the planet for some reason, and we all fancied one of them. It was kind of, the 1996 summer, I always say, it was just very, very unique. Much like how people may look on last summer, when England do well, somehow the country just seems to take it on, don't they? And I think when they'll look at 2018 a bit like it, but 1996 for me was a special year.
Yeah, and I think because, like, for me as well, at the age I was at, I was fully aware of everything going on.
Yeah.
I was well into my music and I was well into my football, and it just all meshes together to create, like you say, it was just a very memorable year, memorable time. I could, like I said, I could talk about that for hours. But I just wanted to quickly get you on your other podcast, which is Wrestling Origins.
Yeah.
Which I got to be honest, I've only just discovered sort of recently as I was getting ready to speak to you today, which again looks on paper like a really unique idea. Is that first, what is it, and is it a weekly show?
Yeah, it's very new, so that's why. Yeah, you might have only just discovered it. I think, well, the basis of it, where we weren't doing so many Gorilla Position shows, it was just an outlet to chat more wrestling, to be honest. And Joel, who I mentioned is part of our Alive and Kicking show, is a massive wrestling fan, and he wanted the opportunity to just chat some graps at some point as well. And so we had a talk. We were trying to find a niche in the market, really, because I think of all subjects in podcasts, I think wrestling, there are so many podcasts.
Yeah,
there's some great ones out there. Parts Unknown, give that a shout. The Kick Out, the Pro Wrestling Show on Talksport. There's some great shows out there, and there's some very not so great shows as well. So we were trying to find a niche, and he'd actually just happened to mention me a couple of weeks before that he was watching Seth Rollins' NXT days and his first kind of appearances in WWE television, and I kind of thought that might be a nice angle. Sort of researched if there was anything in it. So basically, what we do is we discuss wrestling firsts, whether it be the first WrestleMania, the first SummerSlam. The last show we did was the first ever WWE draft in 2001. Obviously, because we had the Superstar Shake-Up recently, so we kind of tie it to what's going on in the wrestling world. We'll do a Money in the Bank show next week because Joe was away this week, so we couldn't do one before. And we've also done. I think we've done one show on a Superstar, which we're going to do more of. So where we look back at their first WWE matches, their sort of beginnings in the wrestling world, their origins, if you like. So yeah, it's kind of looking back while also talking about the modern product and what we like and what we don't like as well, previewing show. So yeah, the sort of the essential, the sort of selling point is it's the first place for wrestling first is what I call it. So yeah, it's been, we've watched some really interesting shows. We watched the first Starcade, which was, if you want a different era, the early 80s that was a hard watch for somebody who's used to the razzmatazz. I got into wrestling in my first memories of kind of SummerSlam 90, Hogan Earthquake. That's kind of the first pay-per-view I remember watching, and that was very much wrestling from a bygone era, but fun because it's nice to go back and look at something I wasn't aware of before, and then to look at other wrestling shows that I do love looking back on. So yeah, it's looking at the firsts of wrestling, really.
It's a really cool idea, and like when you think of it, I suppose if you run out of firsts, you can just do, like you say, like origins of characters and stories, shows, storylines.
Exactly. It's
a big old thing.
Yeah, we're gonna play on as much as we can and then stretch the theme because I think there's legs in it, as you say. You can kind of adapt it to as much as you want.
Oh, definitely. I was saying to I don't know if you'd come across her, Laura Morrow, who's like a UK. She's a writer, she is, but she's also like a bit of a wrestling podcaster.
Yeah, I know the name.
From UK. And I was saying to her, like, I could do just a podcast on Bray Wyatt, just for like an hour, just discussing his character from his debut in NXT and all the way up, and all the different storylines where they missed and messed it up. I just trying to find someone who's that interested in him to do it with me.
Or you can start with Bray Wyatt and then do that on it could be like a power profile or superstar profiles and go to others one. But Bray's a great player to start with because, as we've already discussed, there's so many missteps in his character and There's some. I don't want to do him a disservice because there are some top moments that he's had as well. But for the majority, I think fans like yourself, who's clearly a big Bray Wyatt fan, would be disappointed that we haven't seen more of that. Like more of him as WWE champion, even more of the Wyatt family. One of my favourite moments was him and Triple H, that tease they did when he kind of stroked out
and never paid it off.
And then they never pulled the trigger on it. So yeah, that'd definitely be a lot of legs. That'd be a good podcast to do.
Yeah, one of the most memorable moments actually is when they faced off the Wyatt family against the Shield.
Yeah.
And they were stood on opposite sides of the ring and they hadn't even touched each other and the crowd was going crazy.
Yeah.
And even that was like a very short feud. I think they only had one pay-per-view match, Elimination Chamber, maybe two. So, you know, it's just weird how they never quite, the Wyatt family, they never quite got behind them. So yeah, I did like some sort of, it was called Fightful Books It with Fightful.com on their sort of Patreon service, where we did like some like create fancy booking if you like, and we did one for I think WrestleMania, and that was loads of fun, and that was my first sort of delve into any sort of podcasting or anything. So I think I'm going to bring back sort of on my channel like a combination of that and, like you say, like the perhaps going through different characters and where they could have gone and where they should have gone. And
definitely, yeah, there's definitely some work to do on that for sure. Yeah.
So just before we sort of start to finish up, let's go to a bit of footy. What? How do you feel as a QPR fan right now?
Oh God, that's a $64 million question. Slightly optimistic, actually. I mean, it was a funny old season that we had. Terrible start, losing the first 4 games, and then that sort of annihilation at the Hawthorns where we lost 7-1 to West Brom. Great bit in the middle where McLaren brought in some great loan players, and we kind of, at one point, were kind of sniffing around the playoffs up until Christmas. And then we kind of tailed off. I mean, I think the Championship it's a horrible league. It's in the best possible way. It's a slog. It's one of the hardest leagues to get out of, especially if you've got a limited budget. Obviously, we were under a transfer embargo in January as well, so we couldn't bring anyone in. I don't think McLaren was ever really the right fit for Queen's Park Rangers. I think he's a coach. I think we've learned over the years that bar a very good spell in Holland and what he did in Middlesbrough, he's never really pulled up any trees anywhere else. You know, he played it at Derby, he never worked at Newcastle, and again here, I think he was too rigid in his formations, too rigid in his selections. The players looked kind of dead after Christmas because he wouldn't really sort of mix up the squad. So I sensed his time was going to be up. He relied too heavily on the loan players as well. So, you know, we've got Mark Warburton now.
I think
interesting.
Good. I'd like him.
Yeah. I think for what we are as a club now, it's a hard sell. We've got no money. We're relying on a very impressive bunch of youngsters, but they are a bunch of youngsters at the end of the day, and they will need nurturing, and they will need a few experienced heads in there. We've let some very experienced pros go this week who may have been part of that, but they clearly are not now because their contracts are up. So I think Warburton is the right guy for the job that was at hand. It's of the options that were given to us at the time when McLaren went. You know, you're looking at guys like Tim Sherwood and Michael Appleton. I would have stayed very, very clear of, especially Tim Sherwood, who I would want nowhere near the club, to be honest, from looking at his CV and just his whole profile. He's just not for me. So yeah, I'm optimistic with Warburton. He's already said there are a lot of the right things, which is easy to do, I know. But if you can do pretty much what he did at Brentford, which is a bit of a bad word for QPR fans, at Loftus Road, then I think we'll be happy. I mean, we know who we are. You know, if we stay up and have mid-table obscurity next season, that's a good season for us. We're not going to push the playoffs. We're not going to be promoted. You know, the teams coming down look pretty strong. Cardiff yourselves, if they've got Neil Warnock, we know how well Neil Warnock knows this league. We know firsthand how Neil Warnock knows this league. So, you know, Cardiff will be a threat already. Tony Pulis has left Middlesbrough this morning, so they'll get maybe Chris Hughton. They'll be a threat. So, West Brom, you know, we're not at the top of the table. So we know where we are, and I'm slightly optimistic to answer your original question.
I think the thing is, when Cardiff got promoted season before last, we had just avoided relegation through Warnock coming in and sort of saving the day. And we were in very much the same position. We didn't have any money. We were trying to get rid of players on high wages. We would have been happy with avoiding relegation and mid-table safety would have been the aim. And then we went up. So I think, like you said, QPR have got a lot of good young players.
Yeah.
I think, however, the Championship can be the worst league out of all the leagues if you've got really young players who are inexperienced. I think in League One, they can do very well. And even in the Premier League, where there's a little bit more time and it's not so much of a slog, sort of 3 games every week. I think in some ways, young players can flourish a bit better in the Premier League, whereas the Championship it's like game. If players hit a bit of bad form, it's difficult for them to get out of it. Whether it's a goal scorer not scoring or a midfielder or whoever not playing very well, I think it's very difficult to break that cycle.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, we've got a guy, Bray Easy, who was given the number 10 shirt at the start of last season, which at QPR means a lot to us through the history of Stan Bowles and Roy Wegley and other Simon Stainrod, Rodney Marsh, all that lot. And a lot of pressure was on him, and he started the season very well. But he's 21; he's not ever had a full season in the Championship. By March, he'd played too many games. You've got to balance the youngsters because they're not going to be brilliant. We're a club like QPR. The youngsters that are going to be superstars are already at the Chelseas, the Arsenals. They've already tapped them up. We know we've got a certain calibre of player, and they've got to be given a chance. And yeah, I agree with you. I think Championship is relentless, is the word I always use. You have Saturday, Tuesday all the time. And it's about balancing the players, which I think Warburton will be very, very good at. I think if we can get a few experienced pros in there to help the youngsters, then I think he'll maybe to balance the squad a lot better. And we've got a kid called Elias Chair who's done very well at Stevenage this season. And people already saying he's going to be the saviour of the club. And it's like, you've got to give the guy a chance. Joe Lumley, who's been outstanding this season in goal, he's still very young. And there's a whole team under Chris Ramsey in the academy that are looking very good, but we don't want to burn them out before that they become the players that they could become. It's really a tricky way to find that balancing act, and luckily I think we found a manager who will be able to do that.
Yeah, I think you just got to be careful. I think and fans are the worst for it in many ways. You see like an exciting young player, especially if it's a hometown boy, and you think he's going to take over the world.
Yeah.
But some of these kids are kids. And they can't
all be Kylian Mbappe. Mbappe is almost a one-off, or a Jadon Sancho. These players are special players. Not everyone, and it's just why they're playing for the top clubs in Europe. And they're not playing for QPR because they're of that very special talent. You've got to give these guys, and social media does not help. Young players, because they're trolling out there. As soon as they have a bad game, they'll have 100 comments going, "Oh, get this guy out of the team. He's this, he's that." And after you can't judge a player on one game. You can't. Label him the best that there ever was after a brilliant game and then wonder why he's not doing it 3 days later. It doesn't work like that. No.
I think I'm putting together at the moment, ready for July, hopefully, a series of podcasts and interviews on mental health in sport, and particularly the pressure on football players and athletes and young players and athletes, because it's something which interests me, because my 2 boys, I expect the older one's sort of 14, and he's sort of in and around like that sort of academy level, and he's a goalkeeper, so he always gets the blame for everything. And it's something which interests me, because I see people like Raheem Sterling, I think has handled it excellently, and then I wonder how many of these players who are sort of 18 to 20 who get all this abuse and this, that, and the other every week. How does it affect them? How do they deal with the abuse, the pressure of playing every week? If you're at a Premier League club, you're expected to perform no matter the age. So it is something which interests me. So I've got a few ex-players and journalists and doctors, sports psychologists coming on. So I'm quite looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's a massive pressure. I don't envy these kids coming through, because we had that with Easy last season. A lot of people were calling him lazy, and there were some racial undertones to it. And then people turn things into things that they probably aren't even meaning at that time, because social media can be taken that way. And this all goes on this young 20-year-old who's trying to just make a living for himself and make a name for himself in the game. So, yeah, I think there's it's just not. It's really the pressure to be. I think some people just don't realize, especially those who just keyboard warriors, which you think it's easy to write a tweet out to somebody who's worked all their life to be in the position that they're in, and not they don't take a moment to think, hang on, he's had a bad game, he doesn't need your abuse, and this. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear those podcasts and see and get opinions of what it's like for these guys.
Yeah, I think people forget, don't they, that these guys are human beings, and a lot of them,
totally.
Most footballers retire or are looking towards retirement by the age of sort of 30-ish, mid 30s.
Yeah.
So like even then, like I don't consider myself. I'm 37. I don't consider myself old. I'm sure my kids do. But like, if I was a footballer, I'd be retired now.
Yeah.
So like. It's a lot of pressure for young people. And like I think about what I was like 18, 19, 20, 21. And I think I wouldn't have been able to deal with that.
No, it'd be difficult. Absolutely. Yeah,
I would have dealt with it very badly.
Yeah.
I'd have been in the papers every week. Right. Thanks, Ash, for coming on the show. I do really appreciate it. I know you're a busy guy with your podcasting and your editing and stuff. So I do really appreciate you fitting it in. And you are obviously more welcome to come back on anytime you want to talk a bit of 90s. I wouldn't mind actually if you further down the line, perhaps we'll discuss some 90s music. And
I could do a bit of that. Yeah, the good and the bad. Yeah, everything from Scatman John to Oasis. Yeah, I can do that definitely.
Cool. Yeah, I'd like to do that further down the line. So you guys can follow Ash on Twitter. What's your Twitter account?
At Ash Rose UK on Twitter and on Instagram. So yeah, follow me there. I'm always chatting football, wrestling normally. So yeah, give us a shout.
And you can follow all his podcasts and magazines, which are in his Twitter bio, listed.
Yeah. There's a long
list.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then eventually you'll get to his tweets down the bottom.
Yeah, somewhere along there. Yeah.
Okay. You can check out all our previous shows on our YouTube channel or our Facebook page. It's Ace Podcast Nation on Facebook and YouTube. And Twitter is at ACEcast_Nation. You can request show or send in question for guests on the Facebook page. YouTube is the quickest way to get our content. So please go and subscribe, and just generally come say hi on Facebook, Twitter, and like. Cheers again, Ash, for coming.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And cheers to everyone for watching, and we will see you next time.